they were telling us, that should have been our clue, we're not interested in building anything here. We want to see Jewish destruction. We get to the end of the 50s. UNRWA is not going to settle a single Arab refugees. It can't close because the Arab countries blackmailed the US and the UK.
Welcome to Conflict Voices, your go-to source for insightful discussions and information about the Israel and Arab conflict. I'm your host, Asaf. This interview directly follows the last episode with Professor Kobi Michael. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. And please don't forget to follow our channel. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Einat Wilf with us. Dr. Wilf is a well-known Israeli intellectual. She completed her PhD in political science at Cambridge and served in the Israeli parliament. She has authored several books, including The War of Return with Adi Schwartz, which explores the Palestinian refugee issue. I encourage you all to check it out. Hey, Dr. Wilf. Very nice to meet you.
Hi, hello.
Thanks for being here. How are you? Is everything okay?
I'm okay, thank you.
In your recent book that you co-authored with Adi Schwartz, The War of Return, you mentioned growing up in a politically left-wing area in Jerusalem, right? Can you elaborate about it?
Yes, I grew up in Bet HaKerem, a very secular neighborhood in Jerusalem. At the time, it was politically and sociologically associated with the dominant party of Israel, Mapai, Ma'arach. Today we call it the left, but you would not recognize it as left by any measure at that time. But actually, that was the moment that the Labor Party began to make its transition from being the party of socialism and kind of centrist Zionism to increasingly being the party known as the party of peace. And into the 90s, it became increasingly associated with this idea of land for peace and that Israel can make peace based on essentially handing over land that it acquired as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War. When I can vote first, I vote for Rabin, my first vote, and then I vote for Barak in 99. The 90s are a time of euphoria for me. I believe that the only thing standing between us and making peace is handing over the West Bank and Gaza, just getting out of it, ending the occupation, getting rid of the settlements. I believe that really the only thing standing between us and peace is the settlement project. And if the settlers did not exist, we would have peace. So the 90s really is a time of euphoria when we are putting into practice leaders like Rabin, but especially Barak, putting into practice this idea, finally offering the Palestinians an end to the occupation, a sovereign state, West Bank and Gaza, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem. I could not be more thrilled that a prime minister that I voted for is offering Palestinians this proposal. And like many Israelis, I see Arafat walk away. I see Abu Mazen, the heir of Arafat, walk away 8 years later. Israel under Olmert makes the same proposal, again, even improved in some aspects. So I see Arafat walk away. And this is by now in my own lifetime. You know, it's not 1947, you know, every Israeli kid hears in 1947, the United Nations offers partition, a Jewish state, an Arab state. Jews said yes, Arabs said no. So this is not 47. This is in my lifetime. I'm an adult. I see that. Arafat walks away in 2000. Abu Mazen walks away in 2008. They are not criticized. There's no debate in Palestinian society over the fact that they walked away. Quite the contrary. There was a lot of criticism in Palestinian society for the fact that Arafat and Abu Mazen dared negotiate, but there was no criticism when they walked away. And not only do they walk away, what follows is a massive wave of violence in both cases, but especially after 2000, in the years 2001, 2, 3, 4, you have a massive campaign of butchery that was misnamed the Second Intifada. You know, today on campuses, they call to globalize the Intifada revolution. They say Intifada is this benign idea, like a little shaking off. We've lived through it. We know what it was. It was a brutal, deliberate campaign of massacring civilians. in buses, in cafes, in hotels. And this is weeks and months after Palestinians could have had everything that I believe they wanted, that we were told they wanted. We were told that this is a people fighting to end the occupation, people fighting for their freedom, for their statehood, for their sovereignty. All very legitimate goals, ones that I thought, okay, fair enough. Those are legitimate goals. It's even, I understand if they're being violent to achieve those goals. Many nations, pretty much almost all nations, were violent in their effort to achieve freedom, sovereignty. Okay, I get it. I support that. I want them to have that. And then they can have it and they walk away.
Just before this change in your opinion, you thought you basically blamed the Israelis, I imagine, for not letting go, for example, the Jerusalem and the West.
Oh, for sure. I mean, basically what I felt stood between us and peace is the settlers, is the fact that we weren't offering Palestinians what they deserve, which, you know, they have every right to be sovereign in their own state, and we are the only ones preventing them. So, yes, definitely. My vision was that we are the ones that are preventing them, and as soon as we will stop preventing them, then we'll have peace.
Amazing. To understand this shift in your opinion a little bit better, I wanted to discuss the intifadas,
yes,
to be honest. Before diving into those incidents, can you elaborate about what they were?
So I'm really of the generation that is in many ways formed by the two intifadas. The first one breaks in December of 1987. I am essentially finishing high school at that time. This is when, so my military service is going to be defined by the First Intifada. The First Intifada is really experienced by most Israelis as an uprising of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza against Israel's military occupation, right? Since 1967, when Israel captures the West Bank from Jordan and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, Israel, except for a bit around Jerusalem, does not annex the territory. It manages it by the military, so essentially through military occupation, which is important to say in parentheses, is sometimes people say the illegal occupation, as if occupation is by definition illegal. Occupations are actually a highly legal mean. It's one of the most regulated issues in international law, is a legal means by which you hold on to a territory that you captured in war until the future of that territory is decided in some kind of an agreement. So I thought, okay, they are a people rising up against the occupation. This is how my generation experiences the Intifada. It's also a time when we begin to see the inversion of the David and Goliath. Some of the iconic images of the First Intifada are the Palestinians with the slings. The notion is that they are now the David, we are now the Goliath. Up until then, it was very clear to us that we're the David. We're surrounded by hundreds of millions of Arabs, more than 1 billion Muslims, basically very much devoted to our non-existence. There was no question who's the David, who's the Goliath. The First Intifada begins to shift that vision. We're the powerful, we're the soldiers, they're the young teenagers with the rocks and the sling. So they're with the Molotov cocktails, we're with the tanks. That creates a situation when much of my generation and our politics, this is also after America is victorious, the Cold War is over, there's a sense that the world is changing. We begin to enter an era that was later known as the end of history. The apartheid in South Africa comes to an end. In Northern Ireland, they signed the Good Friday Agreement. So we begin to accept that the Palestinians are not just some terrorists who don't want us to be here. They're actually people rising up with legitimate goals of having ending the occupation and having sovereignty and statehood in the West Bank and Gaza. So that's the First Intifada. And the First Intifada really gives rise to the Rabin government, to the Madrid Conference, together with America and everything that's changing in the world. It gives rise to really the rise of the Israeli peace camp that says, okay, just give the Palestinians what they want, give them a state, give them an end to the occupation, and we'll have peace.
Before jumping to what follows the Intifada, can you tell us what you think about it now?
The first one?
Yes, the reasons for it.
Now I know by the time that I've studied it that even in the first Intifada, there hasn't been a changing of the Palestinian goal. So they rose up. Some people will say today they saw Israel essentially retreat from Lebanon in 1985. They began to imagine the possibility of having Israel. I mean, they definitely wanted Israel to retreat from the West Bank and Gaza. So it's one thing to say, yeah, they wanted Israel gone, the Israeli military gone, they wanted the occupation over. We just made the assumption that they want the Israeli military gone from the West Bank and Gaza, they want the occupation over, and that's it. That's all they want. That they want it for the purpose of being sovereign and free in a state of their own in the West Bank and Gaza, and that those are actually limited goals. And now we know that, no, at no point did they have limited goals.
What do you think now? What is the goal?
So what I know now through the process of the Second Intifada, through the fact that both Palestinian leaders, Arafat and Abu Mazen, when they were faced with clear, concrete opportunities to end the occupation, to have a state, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, they walked away because that was never their goal. Having studied it, having done the research, it's now clear, and apparently it's always been clear, as I say, we didn't listen to the Palestinians, or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. But their goal has always been what they said. From water to water, Palestine will be Arab. I now use this rather than from the river to the sea, because people like to pretend that from the river to the sea is some call for a neutral democracy of equals. By the way, the first to emerge in the Arab world where Jews will be treated as equals, but we're supposed to believe in that fantasy. But if you look at the Arab original, it's very clear. From water to water, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be Arab. That's it. It will be Arab. There will be no Jewish sovereignty. They've been very consistent in that goal. They've actually never wavered from it. And they've always been very clear about it. During the 90s, we actually projected on them what we thought. And when I go back to those images of the young teenagers with the sling and the Molotov cocktails, because those were our images, the David, the Molotov cocktail of early Zionism against the Syrian army in the north, because those were our images, we basically projected onto them the entire package. That if they look like that, they must also want what we wanted. We wanted sovereignty, we wanted a state. When we fought in those ways, it was in order to achieve sovereignty, a clear, limited goal. So we projected on them that if they look like us, they must want what we want. So rather than listen to what they said they wanted, we projected onto them what we thought that they wanted.
I wanted to ask you about the Oslo Accords as well.
Yes.
Before speaking about it, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes. So essentially in the early 90s, as America emerges as this global hyperpower, there's no Soviet Union, it's the end of history, there's a sense of like taking care of business. And America is determined to essentially make peace in this region. It starts something called the Madrid Conference that brings together a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, but essentially the entire Arab world to finally end the Arab-Israeli conflict, all of it. Ultimately, as a kind of sideways from the Madrid Conference, begins a process of direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. Again, it's all in the name, the PLO. And those direct negotiations, rather than the one that were officially with the Jordanian Palestinian delegation, they lead and they take place secretly in Oslo, in Norway, and they ultimately yield accords based on mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. They are temporary, it's very important, they are temporary agreements in order to begin a process of resolving and of building trust, and they are supposed to end within 5 years with a permanent agreement that settles all outstanding.
What did you think about those agreements back then?
Oh, I was euphoric. Again, today we're very cynical to that moment. Like, how could you be so naive? But I always remind people, Israel is never not part of the world. We're never alone. So euphoria sweeps the world at that moment because all the things that seemed impossible suddenly happened, right? The Soviet Union collapsed. The countries of Eastern Europe became free. I remember the countries with their flags and the holes in the middle. Apartheid in South Africa comes to an end. Northern Ireland signed the Good Friday Agreement. So things that seemed impossible, intractable, suddenly were resolved. So it made perfect sense that our little conflict in our little corner of the world will also be resolved in that kind of spirit sweeping the world. So it's not as if we were disconnected. This was the global spirit. And I was certainly taken by it. Those agreements, handshakes on the manicured lawns of the White House, the soaring speeches, no more war, no more bloodshed. Wow, that was something to believe in.
By the way, back then you're speaking about the Northern Ireland situation, and if I'm not wrong, people were thinking that the Israeli situation would be resolved first, and the Ireland one would be harder to resolve, which is interesting. Let's move maybe to the Israeli withdrawing from Gaza in 2005.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this incident and what you were thinking about it?
Yes. So we basically go through a process of, in 2000, Ehud Barak, in the spirit of the Oslo Accords, which were supposed to end with a permanent agreement, says, okay, let's get this permanent agreement. A bit, was supposed to be in 5 years, so 98, but okay, 2000. Arafat walks away. We have those years of butchery, misnamed the Second Intifada. And now Israelis are thinking to themselves, how do we get out of this? We offered them, they walked away, they butcher us in our street. How do we separate from them? A few months ago, I gave a talk in Los Angeles, and there were a lot of people there from the entertainment industry. And someone comes up to me at the end of the talk and he says, look, they got really good, catchy slogans. Free, free Palestine, Intifada, revolution. There is only one solution. It's very catchy. It's very musical. It's like we're just sitting there in our vigils, Am Yisrael Chai. We got nothing. So he tells me, I have something for us. I'm like, sure. He's like, leave us alone. And I'm thinking, you know what? It's actually pretty good because it goes to the core of something very foundational in the Jewish sense of ourselves. It's like, leave us alone. So the Gaza disengagement was very much a leave us alone moment. Today, especially people from the Israeli right are trying to pretend that the Gaza disengagement was hugely controversial. It was actually hugely popular. It was so popular that Sharon, on the strength of having done disengagement, was on the way to getting 60 seats in the Israeli parliament, so half the parliament, something never done before, in order to do disengagement from the West Bank. That's what was on track to happening. So it was hugely popular. And the reason that disengagement was hugely popular is because 80% of the Gaza Strip were already handed over to the PLO in the Oslo Accords. So this was just another 20%. And Israelis were like, let's just get out of there. Leave us alone. Let's just give them the land. Even if they won't say yes, if they won't sign an agreement, we're not going to even ask them. We're just getting out. So that was the spirit. And at that time, I'm working with Shimon Peres. He's in government with Sharon. I remember the dramatic decisions. Sharon was determined to not leave the Palestinians any excuse.
Can you just say who Shimon Peres is?
Yeah, so Ariel Sharon was Israel's prime minister. Shimon Peres at the time was Israel's vice prime minister, very dominant in the Oslo Accords and peacemaking, got a Nobel Peace Prize for that. So the idea is we're getting out. And Sharon was determined that there will be no excuses. Israel will withdraw all the way to the pre-1967 ceasefire line. It's not an official border, it's a ceasefire line, but we'll withdraw to it as if it's an official border. We'll take out the military, we'll take out the civilians, the settlers, we'll take out their graves. It was, I remember, a dramatic decision. We'll get out of the Philadelphia corridor, the border with Egypt. Today, people pretend that border doesn't exist. And his vision was, we're going to give them no excuses. And I think Sharon, what he underestimated was the ability of Palestinians to make up new excuses. But at the time, the thinking was, we're leaving them no excuses. Shimon Peres, being a man of peace, he thought, okay, now you have an opportunity to build something. So we sent them the message. This is right now the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, supposedly the nice ones. We told them, we can leave the homes, we can leave the houses. Those are nice houses. There will be greenhouses. You can build something with that. The message comes back, not a brick over a brick. So basically, they were telling us, that should have been our clue, we're not interested in building anything here. We want to see Jewish destruction. And pretty much as soon as we leave, and it's important to say, you have all these fake maps of Palestinian laws. Actually, the full disengagement from Gaza in 2005 is the first moment in the history of the Arabs of the Levant, the Palestinians, when they finally control land. This is actually the first moment they actually control land. Do they say to themselves, wonderful, Jews are gone, military is gone, no settlers, no brick is on a brick. We're going to turn this into the pearl of the Mediterranean. Gaza has a beautiful beach. This is great real estate from which to build something fabulous. No. They go on to say, excellent, we now control land from which we can take from water to water. Palestine will be Arab. This is what we can do with this land. And they proceed for the next 19 years to the present to weaponize the entire Gaza Strip, to turn this entire strip into an integrated war machine for the singular purpose of pursuing the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state.
You were speaking, by the way, about Philadelphia and the border with...
Yes.
If I'm not wrong, you meant that people are acting like there is no border with Egypt because they're blaming just Israel.
All the time, That's the time. I call it the phantom border or the disappearing border with Egypt. People pretend that there's no border with Egypt. And again, I remember the whole decision was to give Palestinians a border with Egypt so that no one could say that only Israel is to blame. And as I said, Sharon underestimated the ability of Palestinians to make up new excuses and to continue to blame Israel even when there's no reason to. So people pretend, when they said things like Gaza is an open-air prison, that depended on people not noticing that Egypt has a border with Gaza. And you see it even now as Israel continues to resupply the enemy at times of war. Whenever Egypt causes problems for the resupply, nothing is being said. When Egypt allows the resupply to come in, it's commended. If Israel resupplies its enemy at a time of war, something unprecedented of any other military at war, Israel is always blamed for not doing enough. So we already saw that dynamic, and Egypt is a big part of it. I think we're also at fault here that we were too careful with Egypt's kind of standing and honor rather than call them out.
What do you think we should do?
We should have made it clear from the beginning that there's a border with Egypt, that our borders we are at war with Gaza. We are not opening our borders to resupply. We're not the logistical arm of Hamas. And again, and we didn't need to get to Rafah in order to know that Egypt was supplying Gaza. Everybody knew that. We just needed to call it out and to say, Gaza has a border with Egypt from which it was supplied with the weapons that carried out October 7th. It is welcome to continue to be supplied through that borders, not from our borders.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask as well about the phrase that you're using, from water to water. If I understand correctly, it's to emphasize the fact that they don't really want to establish a democratic state?
Precisely. We know things, but I've invented a word in the book called West-planing. When Western diplomats and journalists and now academics and students explain inconvenient things that Palestinians say. Because as I said, what I discovered over the years is that Palestinians always said things clearly. We just didn't listen to them or we West-planed them, but they said those things. But a lot of those things are inconvenient because they have been consistent and clear that a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea is unacceptable, and that they are devoted first in the 20s and 30s and 40s to preventing that state, and when that state was established, to undoing it. They've been very consistent. So people in the West use the term from the river to the sea to say, when Jews on campuses say, this is a term that says that there will be no Jewish state. It's an ethnic cleansing term. It's essentially a genocidal term. People say, no, it has many meanings. Those meanings could be just a free democracy of, everyone's an equal citizen living in harmony. And, they basically expect Jews to believe that from the river to the sea will rise the first Arab democracy in history that treats the Jews as equals and protects them. So that unicorn has never existed, and we're expected to believe in that unicorn and to essentially disband our hard-won sovereignty for that unicorn. So recently what I've started doing is just tell people what the Arab original is before it was translated into the catchy English, which is said, from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. No Jewish state, not some neutral democracy, Arab. So I use it just so people know that, again, in the original, the Palestinians are very clear. And that the meaning still remains when they say from the river to the sea.
Before we began this interview, we were speaking about the usage of the word Palestinian.
Yes.
I imagine that it's very connected to what you're saying now.
Certainly. So I recently wrote a piece looking at the history of the word Palestine. And because today we associate it with Arabs, Palestinians, but a century ago, everyone knew that it meant Jewish. They gave their free country, their sovereign country, the name that was based on their history. Palestine was the colonial name. It was the Roman name, it was the Christian name, it was the British Mandate name, it was the colonial name. That was not our name. So when we have the opportunity to finally give ourselves our name, we call ourselves Israel, because that's our history. Now the name Palestine remains unattached. So the Arabs of the land, especially as they begin to be organized under this temporary agency called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. Now again, it was meant in real time to mean Jews and Arabs, but the Jews were taking care of Israel. So the Arab refugees are called Palestine refugees, and in the UNRWA schools, they begin to develop this national consciousness, which is focused on the idea of a refugee return, no Jewish state, and they begin to adopt the name Palestine, Palestinians, in order to indicate that Palestine actually means exclusively Arab, and to flip what was obvious to everyone before, so that the Jews are now portrayed as foreigners, as people who came to a foreign land. And I know sometimes people say, okay, then you shouldn't call them Palestinians, because it's a name that they basically took. They're Arabs, in the early 20th century, no one knew them as Palestinians. They were Jews and Arabs. When Ernst Bevin in February 47 talks about the irreconcilable conflict in the land, he talks about a conflict between Jews and Arabs. The United Nations proposes partition, a Jewish state and an Arab state. So people told me, don't use the name Palestinian. And recently I actually thought that it's actually the exact name that they should have and be called, because once you know the history, it's the name that shows that they hijacked something that everyone understood to be Jewish. It's not a name that is connected to a deep sense of history and identity. It is precisely a name that reflects the creation of a new identity based on the hijacking of an understanding of what Palestine used to mean, a land connected to one people, the Jewish people, and they hijack that meaning, they hijack that word. So actually the name in many ways is very accurate.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and thanks for elaborating. Let me try to take us back to the subject of this part, which is your personal journey. In your book, The War of Return, you wrote that you try to find moderate Arab leaders,
yes,
right? Can you elaborate about those conversations?
Yes. So as I'm going through this process of examining my foundational thesis, because essentially, as I said, from the first Intifada into the 90s, the Israeli peace camp to which I belong has a basic thesis. And it's an empirical one. The day that Palestinians will have the state in the West Bank and Gaza is the day we have peace. So all we have to do is offer them that. They'll say yes, we'll have peace. Sometimes people say, but we already said in the 90s that's not going to work. Let's say some settlers and all. I tell them, yeah, but it was actually important to empirically test that. So I by now am noticing that we empirically tested that thesis. It has failed in practice. It blew up in the most violent way. So it wasn't just like some minor failure. It was like a spectacular, bloody failure. And then during this time, I'm invited to meet moderate Palestinians. I'm still the poster child of a moderate Israeli. I worked with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Oslo Accords, Shimon Peres. I'm a member of the Israeli Labor Party. I'm not yet a member of parliament, but I'm already active, still a supporter of two states, support the disengagement. So I'm invited to essentially meet my colleagues, moderate Palestinians. They are the creme de la creme, the highly educated, the best universities, English speaking. They're from the negotiation unit of Saab Arakat. We meet for a 3-day workshop. And it's because it's funded by all these do-gooders from Europe who think that the only problem is that we don't meet. So we meet. And they basically tell us during those meetings, because we have time, we have wine over dinner, they say things like, the Jewish people are not a people. You're only a religion. Now, I'm an avowed secularist. The notion that the Jews are only a religion is actually a 19th century construct. I explain it in my course on Zionism and anti-Zionism, which is available online. The idea that Judaism is only a religion is a Western 19th century construct intended to fit Jews into the idea of the modern state. And then they say, and this story you have, that you have a connection to this land, you invented it so that you could steal our own. And I'm thinking, okay, you don't have to believe in God. You don't have to be Jewish to recognize that one of the most continuous, established, historic, cultural, ritual relations between a people and a land is between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. To think and argue that all of that was invented so that at the end of the 19th century, a people could come to a territory with which they had no connection, I thought that was going a bit far. And then they put one and one together and they said, look, because you're not a people, only a religion. You can practice your religion everywhere, but you're not a people. And the right to self-determination is the right of peoples, of nations, and you're not that. And in any case, not only do you not possess that right, but in any case, not in this land to which you have no connection. I came back home from those meetings and I thought, okay, those are the moderates. And if those are the moderates, then how I've been thinking about the conflict, that it's about land, settlements, occupation, borders, and how they think about the conflict, which is what is my people doing here anyway, and why do we have a state? It's like, that doesn't even meet. And I thought, okay, maybe I'm meeting the wrong kind of Palestinians. And I began a journey, which by now is almost 20 years long, to search for Palestinians who will openly and clearly and publicly say, yes, we recognize the equal, not the superior, not the exclusive, the equal right of the Jewish people as a people to self-determination in their historic homeland. Because we are here and they're here, we have a connection, they have a connection, they can't have it all, we can't have it all. It means there's going to be a Jewish state and an Arab state, there's going to be no return, we're not refugees. Just a mutual recognition of equal claims. And over 20 years, I've only ever met 3 such people. 3. That's it.
From how many? Dozens, I imagine.
This is a 20-year journey where I'm not sitting at home. I'm meeting people. I'm giving talks. I'm writing essays. I'm tweeting. I'm public. I'm telling people, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. One of these people, he's a very courageous peace activist. He's very active on Twitter. A few months ago, when I posted that I've only ever met 3 such people, his response was, who are the other 2? He did not say, you're absolutely wrong. There's so many of us, come meet us. He actually said, who are the other 2? Because he knows how rare his position is. So actually just right now, the Students for Justice in Palestine of Columbia, and I've always explained to people that justice is a very specific word in Palestinian coding. Justice means correcting the injustice, which is the very existence of the state of Israel, which is why the chapters are all called Students for Justice in Palestine. They're not called Students for an Independent Palestinian State, which is, again, a limited, clear, achievable goal. No, they want justice in Palestine, but they only mean one thing about it, which is no Jewish state. So the Students for Justice in Palestine in Columbia just recently explained that they do not support 2 states because one of those states cannot be Jewish, because foundational to the Palestinian ethos is the idea from the river to the sea, the idea of return, the idea of perpetual refugeehood. And they actually said, you cannot be pro-Palestinian if you support 2 states. Now, it's really interesting because over the years, a lot of Jews, liberal Jews, said things like, you can be both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli, right? So for many years, especially liberal Jews, both in Israel and abroad, would say, you can be both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli, right? I support the state of Israel, and I support a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. That's being pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. And this is the classic liberal Zionist position. This is the classic 2-state position, one that says it's not exclusive, it's not from the river to the sea, from the Jewish perspective. But the more that I began to study and realize the Palestinian ethos of no Jewish state, I actually realized that the notion of being pro-Palestinian in the nation of merely a limited goal of a Palestinian state next to a Jewish state is our invention, but it's not actually a Palestinian position. So given that the Palestinian position is uniformly, as I said, I've met only 3 who break from that, is essentially that the broadest Palestinian consensus is no Jewish state, given that this is what the Palestinian vision is, Students for Justice in Palestine are actually right. You cannot be pro-Palestinian and support a Jewish state.
Yeah, By the way, I read in your book that you were speaking about 1.5 people that were willing to accept so I'm happy to hear that now it's 3 people that are willing to.
Well, it's 2.5, but I've rounded up. I've rounded it up.
When the refugee problem was created, the 48 Israeli War of Independence. For those who may not be familiar with this war, could you please provide some background on it?
Certainly. As I mentioned in the previous episode, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses, is being carved. It's understood that ultimately the Ottoman Empire will be replaced by states of the local peoples, Kurds, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, and Turks, of course, and Kurds and Armenians. So they're all going to have states, because we begin the era of the 20th century when empires are replaced by states, and ideally nation states, what some today people spew as ethno-states, but was generally understood to be a nation state where people have a certain coherence of language and history and a sense of people. The lands of the Ottoman empires are going to be divided to several Arab states and a Jewish state. The Jewish state is called the Mandate for Palestine. We discussed why that meant Jewish. And Britain is basically given an interim position to help the Jews ultimately achieve sovereignty and to help the Arabs ultimately achieve sovereignty. Now, Britain carries out its promise to the Arabs. It creates Iraq, it creates Transjordan, France creates Syria and Lebanon, and ultimately they carry out their trust. But Britain doesn't carry out its trust to the Jews. So no Jewish state is established, and Britain basically ends the mandate without establishing a Jewish state, and it needs to explain why. So Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, goes to the British Parliament, and he basically needs to explain why Britain failed and why it's taking the mandate, the trust that it received from the League of Nations, and giving it back to the heir, the United Nations. And he says the following: His Majesty's government is thus failed with an irreconcilable conflict. Now this is February 47. There's no occupation, there's no settlements, there are no refugees yet, there's no War of 48 yet. All of the things that we are told are the causes of the conflict don't exist yet. And already he says that the conflict is irreconcilable. And he goes on to say, look, in the areas of the mandate, essentially between the river and the sea, there's 2 peoples, Jews and Arabs. Again, there was no question that were the 2 peoples, Jews and Arabs. And he says each one of them has a top priority, point of principle, the one thing they care about more than anything. He says for the Jews, the top priority, the point of principle, is to establish Jewish sovereignty. So the Jews want a state based on the principle of self-determination for their people in their homeland. Okay? He says for the Arabs, the top priority is to prevent, to the last, the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land, to resist to the last. He's basically saying, look, it's not that the Jews want a state and the Arabs want a state. It's just that the Jews want a state and the Arabs, as a matter of top priority, the thing they care about more than anything, want the Jews not to have a state. That's it. That's the conflict. So the question goes to the United Nations, and the United Nations says, okay, but still the most decent thing to do is to give both peoples in the land a state. So they propose partition, a Jewish state, an Arab state. The Jews are not happy. Look at the maps. It's a terrible state. It's half of what was promised to them, mostly desert. They don't get Judea, which is the cradle of Jewish civilization. They don't get Zion, Jerusalem, where the word Zionism comes from. But they still go to the streets dancing because the partition proposal still fulfills their goal of having a state. Small, truncated, indefensible, but a state. The Arabs reject partition and go to war because it doesn't fulfill their top priority of no Jewish state. And this already establishes a pattern that goes back to the 30s, always refusing any proposal that would allow for an Arab state if there would still be a Jewish state, and follow it up with just murderous violence. So they go to war. But it's important to emphasize that this is an unnecessary war. They could have said yes, had an Arab state next to a Jewish state, and we would have celebrated 76 years of two states living in peace and prosperity side by side. So they go to an entirely unnecessary war because, in their words, they say it, the existence of a Jewish state anywhere is shameful, and they will not agree to it, and they go to war. It's a brutal year-and-a-half war. It begins initially as the war of Arab and Jews in the area, and once the British leave, 7 Arab armies and cohorts invade for the purpose of trying to prevent the Jewish state from coming into being. They failed. Given that their goal was to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state, in that they fail. The Jewish state declares independence and is able to survive the onslaught. This is a year-and-a-half of a brutal war that certainly from the Arab side was declared to be a war of ethnic cleansing and genocide. They made it very clear. They didn't try to hide it. Refugees are created in the course of that war. That's entirely normal. There's nothing special about it. We go back again, the entire 20th century begins with empires and ends with states. This is a bloody process that involved 2 world wars, numerous regional wars, as new borders were established. As states declared independence, tens of millions of people, Hindus and Muslims and Germans and Poles and Ukrainians, they all became refugees. There's nothing special in the Arabs and Jews becoming refugees from the war. By the way, in the areas that came under Arab control, Gaza under Egypt and the West Bank under Jordanian annexation, no Jews were left. Complete, full slaughter and ethnic cleansing. In the areas that became Israel, the Jewish state, many Arabs were left, and they are today Israel's Arab citizens. So no plans of ethnic cleansing that somehow are pretended today. And that's it. And we have several 100,000 Arab refugees, and that's not special, in the course of a war that was, again, entirely unnecessary. And now, what is special and is unique is that those Arab refugees refuse to settle.
I want, before moving to UNRWA and the refugees problems, I wanted to maybe speak a little bit about the atmosphere of this war of independence.
Yes.
You are writing in your book a lot of horrific acts that Arabs were doing. For example, in particular, one that was stuck in my mind was of a group of Jews encountering the bodies of other Jews hanging from trees with their genitalia cut off and stuffed in their mouth. In any point in this war, the Arabs changed their way of behaving, or?
No, and by the way, the reason that in the English version of the book, we included more specifics about the War of 1948. The book came out first in Hebrew in 2018, and the chapter on the War of 1948, we kept it very clinical, very dry, because we knew that generally for a Hebrew-speaking audience, people know what the War of 1948 was. They know that it was a war fought for survival and against essentially a very brutal enemy. But we realized that in the English-speaking world today, and much of the non-English-speaking world, they have an entire different story that was erased. It pretty much looks like this. There was a peaceful, sovereign state of Palestine that existed with people minding their own business. And then in 1948 came the evil Zionists that already in 48, they had tanks and airplanes, and they proceeded to take over the peaceful state of Palestine and deliberately ethnically cleanse its peaceful farming population. And I don't think I'm cartooning too much what people think 1948 looked like. So Adi and I understood is that we actually need to give people a real sense of specifics of how brutal that war was, how much Israel was on the verge of being annihilated. I mean, we really go through the stages of the war. We show how in March 1948, even before the Arab armies invade, the Jews are basically about to lose. before they changed their strategy from defending to going on the offense. But there's a moment when the Jews are losing against, again, the local Arab militias, then against several Arab armies where there was a month before Israel begins to get some arms, where again, Israel could have been annihilated. And that the other side was both very intimately brutal, in the same way that we saw October 7th, that brutalizing the Jewish body is part of how they show their triumph. And that they were also, in their general goals, they made it very clear that the goal was the non-existence of Jewish sovereignty anywhere in the land. And we felt that it was necessary to give that sense of what this war was, first, because people have a bizarre notion of what it was, and two, because only when you understand that this thing lasted a year and a half, how brutal it was, you can begin to understand why refugees were created in that war and why there was no plan for ethnic cleansing.
You wrote as well that these massacres were photographed and sold as souvenirs.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, were there any Arab voices against those violent acts?
Absolutely not. And again, this shows you a lot of people emphasize the current, the October 7th massacre, and they place it in technology. Look what technology has done. Look what social media has done. They had these GoPro cameras. They posted everything on Telegram, the brutality of it all. But I know from our work that technology is just technology, but the same thing happened with different technologies. The same brutality, the same intimate brutality, and then the same taking pictures, selling it, because, again, this was a way to erase the shame. Maybe it's important to say a word, because a lot of people are like, okay, we understand that the Arab goal was no Jewish state, but why? Like, why are they so obsessed with it? What's the big deal? The Ottoman Empire was vast. If the Jews had received their fair share of the lands of the Ottoman Empire, based on the proportionality merely of the Jewish population in the Ottoman Empire, they would have had, the state of Israel would have been 4 or 5 times the size that it is today. What's the big deal with a Jewish tiny state? Like, why the obsession? In no size, as they said, not even the size of a postage stamp. And the way to understand it is that from the Arab perspective, for 1400 years, they have only ever known one kind of Jew: meek, powerless, stateless, at the mercy of the Arab and Muslim ruler. Since the 7th century Arab and Muslim conquest of the region, that's the only Jews they know. And the Jews are in the place of lower people. Now, there were a lot of things that made it clear that the Jews were of lower status to the Arabs and Muslims. Never they're equals. That's why, again, I love all the people who say that from the river to the sea will be a state of equals. So never they're equals. And there were a lot of things that marked them out. But my favorite is that Jews could not ride horses. Horses were a mark of dignity, so they could only ride donkeys. And they could not carry arms. They could not defend themselves by themselves, because their defense was the prerogative of the Arab and Muslim ruler. Sometimes he would defend them more, sometimes less, but it was his prerogative. Now, you know the images of the early Zionist images of the early 20th century. What's the one thing that you immediately notice? They ride horses and they carry arms. Foundational to their sense of building a Jewish state and self-determination is that now they are on equal level, they are going to be free, they are going to be at nobody's mercy, and they're going to defend themselves by themselves. Imagine the shock to the system, the civilizational shock to the Arab and Muslim sense of themselves when the Jews dare challenge their lower status. This is why I always bring the words of the intellectual Constantine Zaraik, the Arab Christian, who in real term coined the term Nakba in the context of 1948. And he says the Nakba is this: 7 Arab armies went to subdue Zionism. The language is specific: subdue Zionism, essentially put the Jews back where they belong, and they turned on their heels and went home impotent. So the sense is the sense of shame. And this is why brutalizing the Jews and then sending pictures in the markets of Jerusalem or GoPro cameras on October 7th are necessary to erase the shame. So technology might have heightened it, but the mechanism is the same.
Let me phrase some parts of your book, if I may.
Sure.
By the way, I wanted to tell you as well that I'm from a left-wing area in Israel as well, from Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. And I think that Israelis don't know those stories. Not at all.
Yep.
The level of brutality. I think that my surroundings still hold the same views as your friends, I imagine, and your surroundings hold back in the 70s and 80s that you told me about. But I wanted to quote some things from your book about what we're speaking, the goals of the Arabs in this war. You said that the Secretary General of the Arab League declared that this war would be a war of annihilation and would go down in history as a great massacre. The coordinator of the Arab forces, Ismail Saftwi, hopefully I'm saying this name correctly, wrote that the goal of the war was to eliminate the Jews from Palestine and to completely cleanse the country of them. The main Arab leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, hopefully I'm saying those names correctly, declared in 1948 that the Arabs would continue to fight until the Zionists were exterminated and all of the Palestine would become a pure Arab state. I imagine that you answered already the question if there were any acceptance from the Arabs leaders of the Jewish state.
So first of all, you see they're consistent and they're clear, to their credit. Yes. There were, in the 30s, there's always a talk about, inter-family discussion, debate, kind of fighting within the Arabs of the land, the Nashashibi family, but ultimately kind of that the Mufti and the Husseinis took over. But even during those kind of struggles, there was never a clear Arab voice in the land that said, we should pursue living in an Arab state next to a Jewish state, which is, again, sometimes you have liberal Jews today trying to go back to early one-staters or kind of binational leaders, people like Martin Buber and others who existed in the first half of the 20th century. And they're like, look, there were Jews who even believed in a binational state. It's not, but they always conveniently neglect that no Arabs ever met those Jews in the sense of had said, sure, we're both in it together. So yeah, the idea of Jews negotiating with themselves, but the Arabs being very clear on where they stand, that's a long pattern by now.
I wanted to ask you as well about the Jewish leadership and their way of thinking or behaving toward the Arabs. Can you elaborate on that?
At that time?
Yes.
So basically what happens is until the mid-30s, the Jewish Zionist leadership continues to hold the very Herzlian view that because the Jews are not, they're not coming to take, they're not coming to oppress, they're not coming to use the resources, they're actually coming to develop, to build, to create. There was a vision that in retrospect, you can call it naive, that they would be welcomed by the Arabs of the land. From Herzl's vision of Alt-Neuland, there is always a vision that because the Zionists are coming to build, to create, to do something that will benefit everyone, that the Arabs will actually welcome it. And the vision was one of a Jewish state with Arabs living. And there was this very kind of peaceful vision. Beginning in the mid-30s, especially with what is called the Great Arab Revolt, or from the Jewish perspective, the Arab massacres of 36 to 39, it becomes clear to the Jewish leadership, and especially to Ben Gurion, that the Arabs are not going to follow any peaceful plan of dividing the land or even binationalism or even living together, that they are obsessed and committed to violently ensure that Jews will never be sovereign. So beginning from that point, the Jewish leadership begins to plan for understanding that even if there's a Jewish state, it will have to defend itself against an Arab onslaught. Now, it's important to understand why the years 36 to 39 matter so much. The Jews actually had their state by then. The state of Israel exists in all but name already in the 30s. And it's because of the vision of Herzl and others that it actually exists at the right time in history. Just as Jews want to escape Europe, there was a state that was supposed to be ready for them because the Jews had prepared it. But what happens is because of Arab violence, and as a result, British betrayal, because the Arabs are more numerous, Britain has interests that go all the way to India, the Arabs matter to the British. So because of Arab violence against the Jews and British betrayal, Britain actually betrays the trust that it unanimously received from the League of Nations and closes the doors of immigration to the embryonic Jewish state. It prevents the Jewish state from emerging and closes the doors. And I emphasize that because people like to pretend that the Arabs have nothing to do with the Holocaust. The Arabs actually have a substantial responsibility that in their violence and their obsession to prevent even the establishment of the tiniest Jewish state, there was a proposal for 170% of their original land, which again could have saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews. But Arab obsession with subduing Zionism with no Jewish state meant that the Jews had no state. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that Israel was established thanks to the Holocaust, kind of like a gift by guilty European nations. Mm-hmm. It's actually the opposite. First of all, after the Holocaust, the Jewish leaders pretty much assume that there will be no Jewish state because there's no Jews. That's it. And it's only really through vision and diplomatic triumphs that they're ultimately able to reestablish the idea that there will be a Jewish state, even if it's only on half of the land, get partition. But as partition passes in the United Nations and the General Assembly by 2/3, could never happen today, the Jews go dancing, but Ben-Gurion already knows that it will be war. Because the Arabs, as they made it clear on the eve of partition, they said, even if partition passes in the UN, we will go to war because we will not let this shame of a Jewish state continue to exist. So the Jewish leaders, they're focused on having a Jewish state, but they already understand since the mid-30s that they will have to defend it.
I can, by the way, elaborate about what you're saying, that Ben-Gurion, during the 20s, they were thinking, Ben-Gurion and others were thinking that the British will accept the Jews, the Arabs will accept the Jews, and the Jews will come, right? And all of those things didn't happen, so everything collapsed eventually. But I want to go back to Ben-Gurion himself and the leadership of the Jews during this war. Mm-hmm. You wrote as well in your book that in 1937, David Ben-Gurion, the main leader, obviously, and the future first prime minister of Israel, wrote that the Jewish state would need to treat its Arab citizens as if they were Jews, with all full equal rights in all areas of life. Mm-hmm. Few years later, he wrote as well, Ben-Gurion, it is unimaginable to have a Jewish state without complete and absolute equality for all of its residents and citizens. In a Jewish state, it is possible for an Arab to be elected as a prime minister or president. Can you explain about this major difference between the way of thinking and behaving?
No, they were completely consistent.
Between the Arab side and the Jewish side.
Oh, from the Arab side and the Jewish side. Again, it goes back to what Bevan correctly noted. The Jews wanted a state. They understood, especially after the Holocaust, but even before, they understood that that state would have a sizable Arab minority. Sometimes people look at the partition map and they say the Jews were planning ethnic cleansing because the Jews would never have been a majority in their state if they did not expel the Arabs. But what again they conveniently forget is that because of Arab violence, a lot of Jews were not allowed into the land, and they were languishing in displaced persons camps across Europe and in Cyprus. And the leaders of the embryonic Jewish state, they knew that as soon as they declare independence, the first thing they do that will really mark their independence is that they will open the doors to all those Jews languishing in displaced persons camps. So again, no one had to be displaced, and there would have been a natural Jewish majority because of Jewish immigration from the displaced persons camps, Jews that were prevented from immigrating because of Arab violence and British betrayal in the 30s. And the Arabs were expected to be a sizable, equal minority in a Jewish state. That was Herzl's vision, that was Ben-Gurion's vision. Again, no one ever denied that there would be Arabs and they would be treated as equal citizens. But it has to do with the sense that, again, from the Jewish sense of self, being on equal par with Arabs, being equal citizens, that fit very much their sense of how you treat minorities. From the Arab perspective, to be in any kind of equal position to the lowly Jews, that was humiliating.
Yeah. Okay, because we're running out of time, I would like to jump to discuss UNRWA a little bit before we finish. You stated in your book as well that during the 60s, the position and the goals of UNRWA changed?
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
So we brought it to the point that there's nothing unique about Arab refugees being created in war. Refugees in general. What's unique is that the Arab refugees refuse to settle. Why? Because they understand that if they settle, the war is over, the Jewish state gets to live, and as we know, their singular obsession is that there will not be a Jewish state, which is why they refuse to get the memo, which all the other tens of millions of refugees got throughout the 20th century, which is, this is the march of history, the empires are gone, these are now states, these are now borders, wherever you fled to, that's your new life, it's tough, it's tragic, and you move on. So the general thrust of the 20th century is to settle refugees, and war, accept borders, move forward. The Arabs are not willing to accept the Jewish state and any borders. So they're saying, we're not settling. And a temporary agency was established to settle them. It was going to be called Riwa or Nurwa. And the reason that it was temporary for 18 months it was understood that it takes 18 months to settle several hundreds of thousand refugees in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon or in new places, but that's it. You invest money, you give them work, and ultimately they move on and have new lives. You read all the early UNRWA memos, that's the vision. But the Arab refugees proceeded to attack the staff, to attack the installations, because they were like, we're not moving on. This war against the Jewish state, it's not over. So what they did is they essentially hijacked UNRWA. They ensured that it was called UNRWA, so the letters UN would appear there. They made sure that it never closed and that it got a loophole so that they can create rules for themselves that are not part of the international standard. Those are all the things that they were able to use the power of oil, the power of Arab numbers in the 50s to achieve for themselves. And then, so now we're stuck. We get to the end of the 50s. It's clear that UNRWA is not going to settle a single Arab refugees, but it's also, it can't close because the Arab countries blackmailed, especially the US and the UK, but the West in general, to never close UNRWA. Because the ability of UNRWA to inflate the numbers of refugees, to not settle them, depends on the fact that it never closes. So after 76 years, it's still temporary, by the way. So we're stuck. It can't close, but it can't do what it was supposed to do, which was settle the Arab refugees. So it begins to do busy work. Initially vocational training, let's give them some skills, ultimately they'll move on. But the vocational training actually becomes this vast educational network of the UNRWA schools and the UNRWA neighborhoods, misnamed refugee camps. And in those schools, a new national identity is born. The Palestinian national identity, that's when the word Palestinian really begins to refer to this group, based on the fact that they're Palestine refugees. And there's nothing wrong about a new national identity being born. Like a lot of national identities were born after World War II. That's okay. It's just that the Palestinian national identity becomes one that is singularly focused on revenge and return and the obsession with no Jewish state. And what UNRWA basically becomes is it becomes taken over by the Arab refugees themselves, like the staff, the teachers, everyone is Palestinian. The letters UN are very deceiving. People think those are actually Norwegians and Swedes. No, those are all Palestinians who believe in from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. And UNRWA has actually, since the 60s, become the ideological backbone of the violent Palestinian war against the Jewish state. And this is why UNRWA always gives birth to violent terrorist organizations, because it basically tells every Palestinian child under the letters UN and with Western money that there was once a mythical state of Palestine, and it was stolen from you by evil Zionist colonial European lowly Jews. And when you grow up, it is your noble duty to take it back. So of course you're going to give rise to generation after generation of people committed to a violent struggle to restore honor, to remove the Jews from the land that is exclusively theirs. And that's what UNRWA does.
You mentioned as well in your book that children in UNRWA schools are taught to idolize figures like Azadin al-Qassam and Abed al-Qadir al-Husseini. Hopefully I'm saying the name correctly again. Can you tell us who these figures were?
Those are all people who, from their understanding, fought for Arab honor against foreigners, against Jews. It's a full ideological backbone that and in many ways you could almost say it's a tragedy, because it's one thing if everyone was clear about the fact that Palestinians were always supported by the greatest anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power of the moment, right? They have a close collaboration with the Nazis in the 30s and 40s because they share their desire to make sure that Jews don't have liberty and can defend themselves. In the 50s and 60s, the Pan-Arabists support the Palestinians while they ethnically cleanse Jews from all over the Arab world. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, it's the anti-Zionist Soviet Union that supports Palestinians. Now it's Iran. So it would be one thing if everyone was very clear on who supports them, just like everyone knows who supports, let's say, North Korea. But the fact that UNRWA funnels the nice letters of UN, the money of nice countries like Australia and the UK and France, that it funnels this money, actually makes the Palestinian cause of revenge, return, no Jewish state, appear legitimate. And that's why in many ways UNRWA is almost more dangerous on many levels than Iran, because people can understand that the Iranian regime and its support for Palestinianism has very clear vision. But when it's UNRWA and the letters UN and it's Australia, then people actually think it's a legitimate idea, and that's dangerous.
Yes, I agree. Before finishing, my last question, if I may.
Please.
In your book as well, you wrote that students in UNRWA schools in Gaza would say every morning while standing in formation facing Israel, those sentences. Palestine is our land. Our goal is to return. Death will not frighten us. Palestine is ours. We will never forget. Palestine, by God and by history, we have sworn to shed our blood for you. How did it come to be that Western countries are funding such a hateful content?
So first of all, again and again and again, we see that they are clear, they are consistent, they are open about what their goals are. And I always say that if there's one thing that I'm very proud of the book, is that a D&I gave Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. And that goes to your question. Why do so many people not see it? And I've invented a word in the book, I call it West-plaining. Again, when Western diplomats and journalists explain away inconvenient things that Palestinians say, such as this. But I have to share with you something. I've been doing this for 15 years now, working on the book, advocating, writing, speaking to European and American diplomats about UNRWA and its dangers. For years, I would actually tell them things like, you're sitting there smugly in your European capitals, thinking that you're doing good by funding UNRWA, and my people will pay for it in blood. Because just to know, in Gaza, 75% of the people who live in Gaza are registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine, right? But they're in Palestine. Let's agree that Gaza is Palestine. So how can they be born in Palestine, never left Palestine, but they're still refugees from Palestine? They know what it means, what you read. Palestine from the river to the sea, no Jewish state. But this is funded by European countries. This was funded for decades by the United States. I was like, don't they get it? So one explanation was West planning. It's still, I think, a dominant one. They don't take Palestinians seriously. Sometimes I would meet with European diplomats and they'll be like, Palestinians know that they're not returning. They understand that Israel's here to stay. It's a delusion. I'll be like, they're not being irrational. Open a map. They see 7 million Jews struggling to survive amidst 500 million Arabs, nearly 2 billion Muslims now, by and large, the majority of which very devoted to their non-existence. You know, the Nazis thought of the final solution when they counted 11 million Jews. So 500 million Arabs and more than 2 billion Muslims look at 7 million Jews. From their perspective, entirely doable. The fact that you think they're being irrational, again, give them some respect. They're looking at the numbers. They're opening a map. They're not being irrational when they believe that. It will take them 50 years, 100 years, however long it takes them. They believe that from water to water, Palestine will be Arab and there will be no Jewish state. So one way, and I think it still explains a lot, is this complete, sometimes I call it neocolonialism, the complete unwillingness to respect Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims, that they actually mean what they say. But sometimes I have a darker thought that creeps into my mind, which is, do they actually support it? Is there something deep in the European and Western psyche that still hasn't come to terms with the idea of a Jewish state? Is it that they too claim to support a Jewish state, Jewish equality, Jewish sovereignty, but could it be that deep in their civilizational identity, the idea of Jews in a military defending themselves, fighting for themselves, being free and equal, that something there still doesn't sit well with them, and that their way of managing that kind of civilizational dissonance is to fund UNRWA?
Yeah. You remind me that I was reading in another book, amazing book, by the way, about protocols from meetings of US diplomats and Hitler.
Yeah.
And they were speaking about the Jews' problems, and Hitler were asking this diplomat if he understands that there is a Jewish problem, and this diplomat said that of course there is a Jewish problem. But he asks Hitler, why does he keep on with such a brutal acts against the Jews, and doesn't hide it more effectively. But
better to outsource it to the Arabs, right? And then you can pretend to be nice. So it's a dark thought, but sometimes, after 15 years of doing this, and I have to say, once you read the book, it's compelling. The evidence is there. It's all there. So to continue to fund UNRWA in the face of this evidence, I can't help sometimes having darker thoughts about what underlies it.
Yeah. By the way, this book, I read it myself, and I highly suggest for people to purchase it and read it. It's amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. It was an amazing conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to Conflict Voices. Don't forget to follow us and keep up with our latest episodes. Join us again next week with interesting discussion about the war in Gaza and Rafah. Shukran and shalom.
Shalom.